It's the most sold book in the world. It's in every hotel in the country. You could probably find one within a couple feet of you right now. And yet, so many of us are still asking, what exactly is the Bible? I'm Pastor Paul Conway. I'm here with my good friend, Pastor Luke Rangel. We're here to talk all things Bible. Luke, how are you?
I'm doing great, Paul. And yeah, I am so excited for this because it's definitely something I wish that I had when I was their age. I mean, it wasn't until maybe 2 or 3 years ago where I actually really started to understand the Bible, and it just opened up so many things for me to know about God. And it's just so cool.
And so this whole conversation is us asking questions about the Bible. And when it comes to asking questions, we could go a million different ways. We want to keep things going in the same direction. So today, we're just asking the question, what is the Bible? What's happening in the Bible? Like, what's the actual narrative beats? What's the deal with the Bible?
Yeah. And so with that question, let's go ahead and just ask that, like, what is the Bible?
Yeah, take some time, audience, as you're watching along with this. Turn to your neighbor, take 15, 20, 30 seconds, answer the question, what is the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind that I constantly say is the Word of God. Anything come to your mind?
I've heard a lot of people say, like it's like a love letter of God to people. Yeah, very. People will say like it's a book of morals, like a good book. Some people treat it as like a history book.
I feel like we could keep coming up with so many answers. There's so many different ways that we could take this.
Yeah, that's actually why we opened up with this question, is because often we want to give one answer. But I would argue that the Bible isn't one thing. It's a collection of things. It's a collection of stories told from many different people groups and perspectives, told over thousands of years, and it's all pointing to one story, the story of God and humanity reaching out to one another.
That sounded really good. It sounded like you really thought about that answer and maybe even scripted a little bit.
It sounded like I wrote that on a script and then made sure that we said it right.
It's crazy. But my first question is, what do you mean by God and humans like reaching out together?
Yeah, so it's important for us to recognize what the Bible is and what it isn't. I think so many of us think of the Bible as like this book that descended from heaven, and when we open it, it's exactly what it's always been. But I don't think that that's the case. I would argue that the Bible is co-authored. It's co-authored by God and humanity. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the who, like who wrote the Bible. But I think it's important for us to recognize all of the different like hands that have gone into creating the Bible.
Right. Okay, so the Bible didn't just fall from the sky like manna, and it was co-authored between God and humans. Is there any kind of like examples to kind of show this?
Yeah, well, the tough thing about the Bible is there's no like by line. It's not like the Bible by God.
Right.
But we can see some evidence of this. And so actually, hey, audience, if you are watching along, I hope, hey, good to see you. Luke, grab your Bible and let's go to like Matthew 17:21. This is a good example of kind of what we're talking about. So give you some time, kind of turn to that.
All right. Matthew, first book of the New Testament. 17.
Well, probably not the first book written, but we'll talk more about that later.
20. 22. I don't know if my Bible's broken.
There is no 21. That's the whole point. There is no Matthew 17:21. Hey, if you're watching along, and you probably won't find a Matthew 17:21. Most Bibles are going to go from 17:20 to 17:22. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about. You see, as these manuscripts are being written, copied, and spread for more people, I mean, these stories are important, and getting it out to the most people possible is important. But as scribes are writing and copying and making sure that everything is working right, things that are notes in the side margin become like part of the main body over hundreds of years. And that's exactly what happened, right? We had an author's annotation that then got put into the main verse, and then the numbers got assigned. We had chapters and verses that didn't come for a long time. And so we assigned these numbers, but then as older manuscripts start to show up, we realize, oh, this verse actually isn't the most authentic to our oldest manuscripts. Rather than throwing off all the numbers, they just took that one verse out. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Is that pretty much why there's different translations of the Bible?
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of pointing to the same idea that we've got a text that's really old, really ancient, And unless we all have comprehensive PhDs of Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, we have to trust that the scholars and the theologians and all of the people have done their job right in getting the Bible to the point that it is now. And sometimes, like this example, it takes time. I guess that's what I'm saying is the Bible is a process. And so that's why we can't think of it as just something that fell from the sky.
Right. Yeah. So that makes sense. It didn't fall from the sky. It was co-authored between God and human. So that is the Bible.
And I do want to say that doesn't mean that that means that God is in this. Like God is orchestrating all of these things happening. So I don't want you to think that it's just like a bunch of like fools bumbling around either. Like God is inspiring, and that's where the co-authorship comes in. Like God is coming into this.
I love that. I love that. So can we actually like get into the Bible now?
Let's get into the Bible. We've talked enough about it. Let's get into the Bible, and let's start at the beginning.
The beginning. So the beginning, first 5 books, I believe it's called the Pentateuch. Is that right?
Yes, the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's basically like the origin story for the earth, but also the origin story of a nation called Israel. And if you've read the Bible, you've heard that name. If you haven't read the Bible, you're going to hear the term Israel a lot.
So it's kind of like when I think of Israel, it's like the founding fathers of the Revolutionary War. That's kind of like Israel when the current Jewish people read the Pentateuch.
Yeah,
type of thing.
Or even ancient Jewish people. Like even people who were living thousands of years ago, when they read Genesis, it's kind of the same way we read about like Abraham Lincoln and James Madison. That's kind of the way that they held that book.
It tells the story of a man named Abraham, who God makes a covenant with to make a great nation out of him. And so Abraham has a son named Jacob, who becomes Israel, who has 12 sons of his own, which become the 12 tribes of Israel. Is that correct?
Abraham has Isaac, and then Isaac has Jacob.
Close.
But that's okay.
That's so close.
Jacob then has 12 sons. If you've heard the story of Levi and Joseph and the coat of many colors, that's where that's coming from. There's 12 sons and their family. They flee to Egypt. And over time, families become a people group after generation after generation. So now we've got this group of people all coming from Abraham, and they're living in Egypt as slaves and captives. And this is where we get to the story in Exodus, the book of Exodus. If you've heard of Moses, if you've heard of the Red Sea, Moses frees the Israelites and take them to the land that God promised Abraham.
Yeah, and so far in the beginning of this Pentateuch, especially with Exodus, it's more of like a literal story. And then it goes into a bunch of laws with like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which, to be honest, I kind of skimmed through.
Yeah, I feel like anytime we get to like the laws, if you've ever tried to read the Bible from beginning to end, you kind of get stopped around Leviticus and Deuteronomy because, it gets kind of boring. Right. But that's kind of by design. As these groups of people are moving into this place, they need to establish themselves as like a group of people with laws and rules, and to set themselves apart from the nations around them. That's what those laws are. They serve a purpose. And as those laws are established, Moses passes away, and then Moses' successor comes, and we get Joshua.
All right, so Moses passes away. We have Joshua, the next leader. I think some were wondering if he was like the new Moses type of thing.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, that was in the sense that he was the next leader of these groups of people.
Next leader. But then after Joshua, we have a bunch of judges.
Yeah, so after they've settled in Canaan, they start to spread out, and then God appoints what's called judges, and they're kind of like quasi-leaders of this group of people. But it's not until we get to 1 Samuel that we see Israel become an actual nation with an actual king. And Samuel is the last of these judges. And Samuel appoints, because of the request of the people, Samuel appoints a king named Saul.
So King Saul, but that's not really a good thing, right? Because, I mean, God is ultimately our king. He didn't really want us to have kings.
Yeah, exactly. God says like, hey, I'm your leader, but also God does agree to work with the Israelites anyways. God provides Saul, and Saul proves to just be a pretty bad king. But after Saul, God raises up another man named David. And that's where we get like the story of David and Goliath and a bunch of other like classic Bible stories.
Yeah, we heard a lot about David growing up in Sunday school and things like that. So David was like a good king, right?
He was definitely better than Saul for sure, but David also proves that he himself is a subpar king compared to God.
And David is who they say actually like wrote Psalms, right? Where does that kind of fit into this whole Bible?
Yeah, so if you've read the Bible and if you've ever been to like a worship service before, you've probably heard some of these Psalms. A lot of them are attributed to David, but there are a lot of authors. The Psalms are a part of a section of the Bible called wisdom literature.
So we've got Psalms, which is a lot of songs and temple worship, as you said. And then we also have Proverbs. We have Ecclesiastes, which is a collection of wise sayings. And Song of Solomon, which is all about
love. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Job as well is also considered a poem or wisdom literature. Even though Job is a story, like it's a narrative, it's not a collection of sayings. It is considered a poem or wisdom. And we read it, we can see like all throughout. We see the first line of Job is like the land of Uz.
Yeah, I always wondered, like, where is this land of Uz? I'm thinking of like the Wizard of Oz or Power Rangers with Zordon and a floating head.
Zordon, yeah, and Rita Repulsa is the bad guy. Although we don't have Rita Repulsa in the Bible. There's a lot of conjecture about where Uz was, but it's typically assumed to be like over there. Like when they start the story, they're like in a faraway land. And all throughout this book, it's so poetic and the way it's structured. And if you were an ancient Israelite reading the story of Job, you would read it as a poem. You wouldn't read it with the same lens that like the narrative like histories are.
All right, so we've got Psalms, we've got Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job, which feels so different from what we were reading with like Exodus and Judges and a bunch of laws, right? Should we be reading these differently than what we read or understand them differently?
Well, yeah, they are super different. And maybe one way that can help us understand these differences is to understand like the people telling these stories. And we'll get into the who a little bit later, but like for Proverbs, it actually helps me understand Proverbs more if I picture my grandma like reading these to me.
Huh. I could picture Grandma Paul. But why is that? Is that mainly because she's old?
Well, first of all, careful. But second of all, kinda, yeah. My grandma's been around for a while. She's gleaned a lot of wisdom and experience over the years. And so when I think of like, oh, I'm really struggling with this kind of like this problem or this life dilemma, I would turn to my grandma. And that's kind of how the Israelites would see these proverbs as like a lot of Jewish grandmas giving like sayings and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of my own grandma, I could totally see her saying like wisdom type things. But I don't see her like recounting the history of America or like of Israel.
Yeah, exactly. Like you would hear your grandma say like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's wisdom. But you wouldn't go and be like, hey, grandma, could you tell me about like Paul Revere or whatever? And neither would the Israelites. Like they would read the history and know like this is reserved for scrolls and scholars. But like wisdom, that's for my grandma.
And I said it earlier how Genesis and Exodus was kind of like the founding fathers. All these stories were just seen differently depending on what they were, who they were coming from, and just kind of like when they were written.
Yeah, definitely. And again, like co-authorship. God is in all of these stories and God is inspiring all these stories, but God is in them differently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I said earlier how Genesis and Exodus was kind of like the founding fathers of Israel and things like that. And all these stories were seen differently based on when they were written, who wrote them, how they were written.
But again, like co-authorship. God is in all these things. God is inspiring all these things, but also God is in them differently. And they would know that. They would see that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I definitely, it's all sinking in now, totally making sense. But so what's next?
Yeah, so this is where the story of Israel gets pretty crazy. We didn't talk about it much earlier. We were talking about the what, but one theme that we see even up to this point is Israel, like God's people, consistently choosing against what God wants. And we see that theme continue here.
I always struggle with this because Israel is God's chosen people. So like, what's up with that?
Well, that's the thing. Even though we see God choosing Israel, we don't see Israel choose God, at least not fully. And the story of Israel, the chaos of Israel gets so intense, Israel splits in two.
Right. So this is the point of the story where we see two different kings now. And so we have one in the north, we have one in the south, becoming Israel and Judah.
Yeah, so things are getting pretty chaotic for these, I guess, two nations now. And it's in this chaos, God starts to appoint prophets. And these are people who are speaking to God's people on behalf of God. And prophets are actually a role we see often, like Moses was a prophet. But these are books in the Bible called the prophets. That's Isaiah to Malachi. And it's filled with God appointing people, warning of the destruction of these nations.
Right. And destruction does come. It's found in Assyria to the north. There's a lot of destruction there. A few hundred years later, Babylon comes, gets destroyed. Judah gets destroyed along with the temple in Jerusalem.
And that's a huge moment. That's like one of the biggest moments for the history of these people so far, is the destruction of the temple. Because again, up until this point, they were kind of living in the promise that God had for them. But it's the destruction of Israel that they're realizing, like, oh, dang, we don't have it anymore.
Yeah, and so the promise you're talking about is the one that God made with Abraham, where he's going to make a great nation out of him and his children, right?
Up until this point, like, God was fulfilling this promise, and the temple in Jerusalem represented that promise. They had gotten to the point where they believed their promises were like filled.
Okay, so is that kind of the whole purpose of the prophets? God told us to do one thing, and prophets want to make sure that we are doing that thing, and if we don't, then destruction will come.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens. Like, they did not listen to God's prophets, they did not listen to God's warnings, and destruction comes. And that's what we call the Babylonian exile. The nation of Judah is destroyed, temple is destroyed, and a lot of the citizens from Judah are taken into Babylon.
That's like the story of Daniel, right? He was one of those Judahites taken into Babylon.
Yeah, exactly. And even now we're starting to see these texts be shaped by the circumstances that they're in. And that's why most people split up the prophets by 4 major sections.
So 4 sections, meaning like pre and post Israel, and then also pre and post Judah.
Yes, exactly. And so depending on when things are happening, it starts to shape kind of the flavor of these prophets, if you will. They're all warnings, but these warnings have more hope or more woe depending on when they're taking place.
And that's kind of how the Old Testament ends, right? There's a feeling of just like mourning and loss, but at the same time, there's hope that this new king is going to come and save Israel from the destruction that they put themselves in.
Exactly. That's like the final message of the Old Testament to Malachi. It's remembering, like, oh man, we were destroyed. We don't have a king. We don't have a temple, but perhaps there's hope for a new king to emerge. I bet you can guess where we're going now. For the next few hundred years, that's kind of how the story goes. There's just a lot of waiting for Israel to come back to its former glory, a lot of waiting for a new king to emerge.
Is that King Jesus?
It's Jesus.
And that's where we go into the New Testament with the 4 Gospels. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all kind of telling the story of Jesus.
Yeah, and it's no secret. Like, this is the huge thing. This is a huge game changer for the faith of the Israelites at large.
Is it even fair to even call them like Israelites anymore? Because it wasn't the whole point of them, like, they got destroyed.
Yeah, I guess they aren't really called Israelites at this point. They're called like Judahites or Judeans. We could probably just call them Jews at this point. I think that's where they get where they've got the name.
So like you said, there's a lot of implications of when Jesus came, because in their minds, God, it was just kind of this being in the sky type of thing. And now here he is as in Jesus' form as a human.
Yeah. Jesus, God is here and he's come to bring news, good news.
And that's where the Gospels come from, because the Gospels literally means the good news, right? The good news of Jesus and bringing them out of that destruction that they put themselves in.
Yes, like God is here, and he's not just here as a pillar of fire. He's here as a human, and that person is Jesus. And Jesus has news, good news.
Yeah, and that good news, that's kind of where we come up with the Gospels, right? Gospels means good news. I know one of my favorite good news stories is the book of Luke.
Yes, it's a good name, right? And in that book of Luke, Jesus quotes scripture that he had: freedom for the oppressed, sight for the blind. He's quoting the Old Testament.
That's got to mean something, right?
Right, definitely. Jesus reading from the Old Testament shows us that he's the fulfillment of the things that have been promised before. God promised a king from the line of David. That's Jesus. Jesus isn't coming in and saying like, hey, I'm a brand new thing. He's saying all of those things that you read about before, I am the fulfillment of that.
But in some senses, Jesus did kind of bring a new thing still, right? Like, we're a Christian church. We sing the worship songs. We're totally different from the Israelites from the Bible.
Yeah, and that's That's a good point. Like we aren't in we aren't in ancient times. We look different. Jesus also isn't saying, "Hey, I'm here to bring things back to the way they were exactly." Because if we were to just get to a point where, things were bad, things got destroyed, Jesus shows up and he's like, "Hey, I'm here to restore the status quo." He's not doing that either. So in some senses, he is kind of bringing a new thing.
Right. And that was a lot of the tension back then as well with even Jesus' followers, even his disciples. Like, here's Jesus. In their mind, he's some warrior that's going to come down to earth, that's going to save them from the Romans and all of this oppressedness stuff.
Oppressedness stuff. Yeah. That's in the Bible, oppressedness stuff.
And then here's Jesus saying, like, hey, let's do the opposite. If they slap you in the face, like, forgive them.
Yeah, well, and that's really the theme of the Bible so far. Let's take some time to talk about this. Like the theme of the Bible is humans have a choice. They have a choice to choose power, they have a choice to choose strength and might, or they can choose order. They can choose to care for the people around them. They can choose ultimately to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the world.
Yeah, and so again, that's just kind of the dividing tension. As humans, we think of power and strength as one thing, as conquering other people, but God sees it more as love.
Yeah, and it's in that ultimate power and strength that Jesus dies. Jesus shows up, challenges that same power and the Roman occupation, like the religious authorities. Their power is threatened. It's the same story we see again and again. These humans want strength, they want power, and they will hurt and kill anybody that threatens that. And in this case, it's Jesus. But Jesus shows us that this is the way that we can live, to serve, to forgive those around us.
After his death, he comes back alive, he's resurrected, and literally beats death in the face.
In the face. I knew you were going to say in the face. Yeah, Jesus, he is the power of this is so not even death can contain it. And this message in the story of Jesus starts to spread like wildfire. Because after Jesus is resurrected, he joins God back in heaven and kind of passes the torch to his followers. And that's the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the follow-up of Jesus's followers spreading this message.
Yeah, and so that's pretty much what the rest of the New Testament is, right? Just kind of epistles or letters talking about how they spread Jesus.
Yes, and things are not easy because it turns out following Jesus is pretty hard. And there are a lot of people trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. And that's where these letters come from. It's a lot of the early church leaders trying to set the course right, knowing that hey, this is what following Jesus actually is.
Yeah, and following Jesus can be confusing at times. I mean, they didn't have the whole Bible like we do now. They just had pretty much the Torah. And so with that, they had to write letters to clarify things. Like, what type of stuff did they have to clarify?
That's a good question. And it is important for us to remember, we are reading letters. We're reading correspondence from groups of people thousands of years ago. And so a lot of it's contextual. It's a lot of things that are directed not at us. I don't even think that a lot of the people writing these letters knew that it would be read by people in the 21st century.
But that doesn't really mean that these letters are irrelevant then, does it?
No, not at all. I mean, we struggle all the time with what it means to follow Jesus. These people are as well. So we can learn from them. And one of the major clarifications was who gets to follow Jesus? Because Jesus came from Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. But one of the clarifications we see in these letters is saying that hey, following Jesus, everybody is allowed to. The covenant that Abraham made with God is now no longer exclusive to just his family. It's really for all of us.
Yeah, and I remember I heard one analogy that really helped me out, where it was reading these epistles, reading these letters was like reading someone else's mail delivered by somebody else. We weren't really invited into the story, but in this case, we kind of are.
Yeah, so it's important to remember, we may not be the intended audience of these letters, but it also means that, we get to participate in this story.
Yeah, and so this is kind of where the Bible ends. We started with the Pentateuch, and then some historical narratives, some poetry, some prophets, the Gospels, and then the New Testament with the epistles.
Yes. Those are the sections of the Bible.
Yeah, so can you kind of sum up this Bible in one sentence?
I don't think I can sum up the Bible in one sentence, but I can try. The story of the Bible starts with one choice, and it's God's choice. God sees what is good, and God chooses to give to us. And then it starts with another choice, our choice, humanity's choice. Humans see what is good, and they take. And we see that same story happen time and time again throughout all of the Bible. Humans see what is good and they take. They want strength, they want power, they want might, and they take. And yet, we see God time and time again choosing to give, to serve, to forgive. And then we see Jesus arrive. And Jesus demonstrates this. When Jesus sees what is good, he gives. And yet we saw what was good and we took. We saw power and we took that power. And that's what gets Jesus killed. We can read the Bible and see it as irrelevant and see it as old and see it as like how it doesn't matter. Or we can see that we're living the same story. When you see something that is good, you have the choice here and now to take or to give. And when we make those choices, in theory, we're living the same story that the Bible is. And so when we understand these stories, when we understand them in the framework that we're given, we can see how our parts are carrying out that same story.
That was a really good run-on sentence.
Yes, and it was the first time that I delivered that take, and this is the first time we're having this conversation. No bloopers whatsoever. We were told to keep this video short. I doubt it's going to be really short, but it's important for us to know what's happening in the Bible. In the following weeks, we'll be looking at who wrote the Bible, when and where was the Bible written, why did they write the Bible. But if we don't know what's happening in the Bible, we can't have those conversations. And so in the next few weeks, I look forward to breaking down these big questions about what is the Bible. Luke, do you have anything more that you'd like to say?
Nope, I'm going to let them get into their small groups.
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, let's get into small groups, guys. We'll see you next week.